Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Elton John and Kiki D, right?
That's right.
Don't go breaking my heart. All right, so we're talking about family law, and joining us in studio today, David Halkett, partner at Macquarie Hunter, and Leah Donaldson, associate in the family law division. You have Sarah as well, an associate. Right. So you have three people there that specialize in family law. Breaking up is hard to do, as the song goes. So we talked a little bit about when you're divorcing and you have had, the example I use is maybe you're 20 years old and a grandparent passes away and leaves you some money, and you've got a basket of money, say $100,000 or something, and then you get into a marriage and you buy a house together and all that kind of stuff. So what's the recourse to try and say, well, that money was mine? And there has been a recent case around that.
There was, yeah. Under the Family Law Act, property you bring into the relationship or received by gift or inheritance, as I said, is excluded.
So my CD collection from when I met my wife is still mine.
Yeah, on the face of it, that would be it. If it's gone up in value, you divide the increase in value.
Oh, jeez, I don't know.
Well, it's funny. Just as an aside, my son saw a CD and he didn't know exactly what it was.
It's a coaster. You put your cocktail on it.
He actually asked me for LPs. How did the music get from the LP through the needle up to the speaker?
It is a bit of a mystery. It's how does your voice go over space and out of the car radio?
Exactly.
Yeah, so yeah, that's.
So what you bring in.
I joke about that. That's really all I had when I got married was a CD collection.
Yeah, no, it's like me. So the increase in value is to be divided under the Act. But a recent case is...
So say the example I used, $100,000, and then you bought a condo and it was worth $400,000, so that was the down payment.
Yep.
Right? So the condo is now worth $600,000.
Yep.
So you split the difference, but you still are able to take your initial 100 out.
You're supposed to get the 100 out and then divide the increase in value,
the raise, and
and that applies to all other assets as well. So if you brought RSPs in at say $100,000, they end up at 200. You're supposed to get the 100 back and the 50.
Right.
The divided. Housing is a little different now because of the most recent case. And what happened in that case? It was a person who received a gift during the marriage from his boss of a large amount of money, and he was afraid of creditors coming after him because he was self-employed. So he put the house in his wife's name, and then said at the end, well, I want my money back because I brought in, it was a gift. And of course, to the whole rest of the world, he was saying, that's not my house, it's my wife's house. But on the separation, he goes, it's my money. So the Court of Appeal says, well, you can't have it both ways. And we have a thing that Leah can certainly discuss far better than I can, doing that comes from estates, but there's a thing called presumption of advancement between spouses. And maybe I'll just pass over to Leah to discuss what that actually means.
Yes, the presumption of advancement just applies between spouses as well as adult children and parents, in that when one party transfers ownership, and that's legal ownership, so when it's registered in one party's name, to the other either spouse or parent or child, it's presumed to be a gift because of their relationship to one another. Whereas normally the law says just because you put a piece of property in someone else's name does not mean that it actually belongs to them. You have a remedy to get that amount back. So the presumption of advancement applies because of the special relationship between spouses, essentially.
So in this case, he actually did put the entire property in the wife's name to get away from creditors.
So that presumption applies.
Exactly. And so he was trying to get the whole $2 million back, and the court says, no, you gifted to your wife, but we're going to deem it a family asset. So the problem is that the case hasn't been limited simply to its facts, which were, I'm trying to get around possibility of creditors, so I'm giving it to my wife. So now it's the at least on the face of it, could be argued that anytime you had an exclusion and you then put your house into a joint tenancy, you've gifted half of what your exclusion was to your wife.
Because of this exclusion.
Because of the presumption of advancement.
Right.
So it's interesting because I had a case.
So is this going to have a major ramification?
Well, to some extent, yeah, because a lot of us were thinking in the first few years of the new act that if you brought it in, it was yours. And now it's like, well, if it's a joint tenancy, do we still have to argue it? And I have a case that's the other lawyer's now saying, well, you've lost your exclusion because of the decision. Whereas most people have to have their house in joint tenancy because they can't qualify for a mortgage otherwise. And that may be a reason to rebut the presumption that if the presumption of advancement only applies to married spouses, then common law spouses would still get the exclusion, whereas married spouses don't. And the whole base of the act was to bring everyone together.
Yeah.
And Leah can talk more about the common law side.
So what do you think is going to happen? Do you think someone's going to challenge this?
Yes.
Well, I think so. And I think that that case, because of the amount of money, might be appealed. And also someone's going to try and it may, maybe in my case, if my client instructs me to argue that, well, we, or any of our cases, like Leah, you probably have some of those ones as well, where there's that if there's enough money, they may say, I want to at least make the argument in court and take the risk of losing that if I'm successful, I get my exclusion, depending on the size of the exclusion. If it's 50 grand, it's not worth it. But if your exclusion is 300,000, even 4, it may be worth it.
And that sort of ties into getting some advice before, it's not just at separation, it's when you're starting a relationship, because this case basically highlights the fact that how you deal with that, those excluded assets, so how you register them can have an effect on what you take away at the end of the day.
So what's going to be the knock-on effect of if this is upheld, that people are going to have money that they don't want to put into a joint asset, right? So that's going to really hinder a lot of people in this crazy real estate market buying a house.
Well, what'll have to happen in that is they'll have to have some kind of agreement between the spouse that says, I've got this money that it's inheritance. You agree it's going to remain mine, or you just put the home in your own name.
But that's probably so would that document hold up when it comes to
divorce?
It would,
yeah. So
that's not that hard to get around it.
Except if you're already married and you get the inheritance, trying to get then your spouse to agree that this is going to remain yours at the end if you break up is probably not that easy to do.
So how does that work? You have just generally, you have a husband and wife, they've been married for 15 years, and one parent passes away, or both. I mean, you inherit a large amount of money. Does that not go into the family unit? Is that still separate?
It's under the act, it's excluded property. So if you kept it separate, the only thing you'd have to divide would be the increase.
So you just stick it in a bank account and you just buy, GICs, and it's spitting out 2-3%. That income you're allowed to take, but the money, the big chunk of money, you're not.
Would remain yours. It almost goes back to the way the law used to be, where if you got a big inheritance or a gift, you told them keep it separate, and then it was still a family asset, but you'd ask to be reapportioned. You're almost doing back to the same argument now.
So you put it in, and everybody can use it, but if anything was to be dissolved, then they agree that to be paid back.
Exactly.
Right.
And if you're getting married, then what you do is you do a prenup.
Yeah.
Prenup.
Yeah.
This is something I think is, because it just seems so clinical, right? I mean, it's one thing about the inheriting money. One's family member dies and they're married after 15 years. Do these big chunks of money that come into the spouse's bank account cause divorces? I can see one's now rich, right? On paper they go, well, I don't need to be with you anymore because I have my own money.
Well, it can. I've never had that come up in any of mine, but I could see that there may be an argument over how the money should be spent, especially if now with the change in law, the wife says, I'm going to keep that money separate. I'm not going to use it.
Well, you can see in a situation, we talked about how you have somebody who is the person that's in charge of the finances and the main breadwinner, and you have the other person that sort of feels disadvantaged. All of a sudden, with real estate in the greater Vancouver area, getting $1 million isn't out of the question. And they might feel like, now I'm empowered. I have my own money. I have $1 million.
That's true.
I'm going to...
It can change the dynamics in the relationship.
Absolutely. I mean, anytime you throw money into the mix, that's when problems can happen, right?
And in a scenario where it could really be a problem is one spouse has already got their inheritance and has put it into family, paying off debt or whatever, and so they don't have anything left. The second one gets it and says, well, I'm not putting it towards our debt. I'm going to keep it separate because, say, I've got legal advice to keep it separate. That can certainly cause a bit of a problem.
I bet. Absolutely. So prenups, like we always hear, it's like in the movies, it's always they want the prenup on the night of the wedding, or right, the eve of the wedding, which is not good advice, I bet, to do it then. So are people more pragmatic and they realize that it's probably not a bad idea? Like we always think of prenups as Hollywood stars and millions of dollars and asking on the eve of the wedding and all, but that's really not the way it works, right?
No, and I do think that people are more pragmatic about it now because a lot of people are getting married later in life, so they do actually have some assets to protect. I mean, there's not really necessarily a need for a prenup if you're 20 and neither of you have anything.
Can you just change the name of it so that it doesn't sound like prenup?
Yeah,
well, they're actually called marriage agreements.
Yeah, we call them marriage
That's the actual
Okay,
neutral
that's a
term.
little friendlier.
Although, when you say about at the last minute, I still get calls. I'm getting married in 2 weeks, and often it's the parents who want them to get it.
Of course, yeah, because they have invested in their children. Like I said, they've got assets, right? The real tough one is probably family businesses.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
They own a sawmill or a lumber company or whatever,
Yes.
and the son or the daughter is going to be running it, and now what do you do?
Exactly. That's always tough.
Yeah, and so your advice is it's better to get it all written down ahead of time.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Especially with the new Family Law Act, the exclusions that you're seeking to protect, if you don't have documentation to prove what those amounts were, it's difficult to make that argument retrospectively. I mean, if you don't have documentation to say this is what it was worth at this time.
So do you have somebody, an evaluation in your law firm that can evaluate a company and say it's worth X number of dollars?
We wouldn't use anyone in our office because we're lawyers, but we would hire out someone to do evaluation. But Leah's right. Trying to get a retroactive is really difficult.
It's very expensive too.
So you want to sort of nail down what the values are before you move forward.
Exactly.
Because most people, unless they're pack rats, do not keep documents of what their inheritance was 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
It just doesn't exist. And then trying to tie the dots are not always easy.
Okay, Leah, our final couple of minutes here. Someone comes into your office and they're in this situation where they're kind of wrapping up their relationship and want to move on. What's your biggest piece of advice?
My biggest piece of advice would be to...
This is free advice, by the way. We're not going to bill you for this.
This is free, and it's not tailored to a certain event or set of facts, but just to take a deep breath. And the reality is you have to keep the cost of it and the emotion of it in check. And that's what we sort of help people do, because no matter what the circumstances are, you don't want to be in a knockdown, drag-out fight that spans years and costs you tens and tens of thousands of dollars.
As the old joke goes, your divorce can cost you $3,000 or it can cost you half your house.
Yeah.
One of the two.
Yeah. That's excellent advice. So we'll just wrap up our conversation. We want to thank David Halkett, who needs to get a drink of water.
I do.
And you've been a champ getting through this. A partner at McQuarrie Hunter, and Leah Donaldson, an associate. Thank you very much. You have 3 people in your family law division there. Sarah, who's been on before. How was your first time, Leah?
Great.
You want to come back?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we will have you back. I'm Zach Spencer. You've been listening to The Law Show on CL 650.